My grandson leaned close and whispered that his parents had been secretly meeting with an agent to find a way to sell my house. That same house where I raised my son and buried my husband's ashes. I kept my face calm so he would not see the storm rising inside me. Yet my chest felt tight, as if the walls themselves were closing in. They thought I would not notice until it was too late. What they could not imagine was how quietly I could fight for what was mine. It was a cool morning on Bainbridge Island, the kind where the air smells faintly of salt and cedar. I had just poured my first cup of coffee when I heard the faint rattle of a bike on the gravel path. Leo, my 18-year-old grandson, came up to the porch with his hair still damp from the mist. He glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure no one had followed him, then leaned in close. His voice was barely above a whisper. "They have been talking to a real estate agent. They are trying to sell your house before summer." I kept my hands steady on the mug, though the heat from the coffee suddenly felt cold against my palms. I had learned a long time ago how to keep my face from betraying me, but inside, the tide was shifting fast. My chest felt heavy, the kind of weight that comes when you know something precious is already being pulled away. I nodded slowly, told him to come in before the chill settled in his bones. The kitchen felt too quiet as he sat at the table, his eyes fixed on a knot in the wood. I knew he was trying not to say more, afraid of making it worse. But I also knew that whatever else came next, the truth had already been planted in my mind. This house is not just walls and a roof. It is the place where I raised my son, where my husband and I planted the apple trees out back, where I carried in groceries through every season. It is where I stood in the hallway that night. The phone rang with the news no one ever wants, and where I placed the urn on the mantel the morning after the memorial. Every floorboard and window latch holds a part of my life that I never thought anyone would try to take from me. Leo's shoulders were tense, and I could see he was holding something back. I asked him to tell me what he knew. He said he had overheard conversations at home, bits and pieces about price points and timing. He had seen a folder on the kitchen counter with the name of a local brokerage on it. He thought it was wrong and wanted me to know before it was too late. There is a moment when betrayal is still fresh, when it feels almost unreal. I sat there, listening to the low hum of the fridge, the faint call of a gull outside. My mind was turning over the details, measuring what was true and what might still be a misunderstanding. Part of me wanted to believe it was just talk. Another part of me, the part that had weathered years of life's blunt edges, knew better. I thanked Leo for telling me. I could see the relief in his eyes, as if passing the burden to me made it just a little lighter for him. He is still young enough to think that truth is enough to change the course of things. I remember when I believed that too. As I stood by the window, watching the ferry in the distance cut a white path across the grey water, I felt the first flicker of something I had not felt in years. It was not anger exactly, and it was not fear. It was resolve, a quiet steadiness settling in my chest. I have lived enough years to know that sometimes you have to move in silence, the way the tide changes without a sound until you realize the shoreline has shifted. Leo asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, that I just needed a moment to think. But in that moment, I was already beginning to sort through the next steps in my mind. Who I would need to call, what papers I would need to pull from the file cabinet upstairs. I knew that if Dylan and Sienna were planning something, they would not expect me to act quickly. That would be my advantage. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Outside, the apple trees stood bare, their branches slick from the morning fog. This house has stood through storms that rattled the windows and winters that froze the pipes solid. I have stood through my own storms too. I am not about to watch it all be signed away without a sound. I walked Leo to the porch, told him to keep this between us for now. His nod was quick, serious. As he rode back down the path, I felt the cool air fill my lungs. There was work to be done, and I intended to do it quietly, carefully, and without giving them the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. For those listening now, you might understand the feeling. When the place that holds your memories is threatened, the fight is not about the bricks or the beams. It is about holding on to the part of yourself that has been built within those walls. And sometimes, the quietest fights are the ones that leave the deepest mark. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow notepad and began writing down everything I could remember from the past few months. It started with the Sunday in late September when Dylan came by alone. He had mentioned how quiet the house must be now, and how much upkeep it must take. At the time, I thought he was simply making conversation. Then, in November, Sienna had offered to help with my property taxes, suggesting she could take over the payments if the deed was in both of our names. I had laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to be helpful. Now those moments lined up differently in my mind. I wrote the dates and details in careful order, leaving space to fill in anything else I remembered. There was the day a man in a windbreaker came to the door with a clipboard, asking if I was interested in a free market evaluation. I had sent him away without another thought. Later, I recalled seeing that same man talking with Sienna in the driveway when I came home from the grocery store. She had waved casually, saying it was nothing important. I thought back to a family dinner in early December. Between bites of roast chicken, Dylan had brought up the idea of downsizing, mentioning a condo in Seattle that was easier to manage. Sienna chimed in about how much money could be freed up from selling this place. They had smiled the whole time, speaking as if they were talking about the weather. That night, I had felt a flicker of unease, but brushed it aside. In January, there was another moment I had ignored. A plain envelope arrived in the mail with a glossy brochure tucked inside. It was from a local brokerage. Across the top was a photo of my house taken from the water, the one angle I had always thought was the most beautiful. I assumed it was part of a mass mailing and tossed it in the recycle bin. Now I wondered how they had managed to get that exact shot. As I listed these events, the pattern became hard to deny. I underlined each instance where someone had approached me directly or indirectly about selling. The page filled quickly, and I could see the timeline stretching like a quiet current beneath the surface of my daily life. I got up to make another cup of coffee and noticed my hands were steady. The shock from the day before had been replaced by something sharper. I was no longer sifting through feeling, but through facts. I went upstairs to the small room I use as an office and opened the file cabinet. Inside were the important papers I had kept in order for years. The deed, the tax receipts, the insurance documents. I spread them out on the desk, noting the dates and any clauses that might matter. I remembered my husband always saying that in a storm, you check your lines and anchors before you look at the horizon. Pulling out the last folder, I found copies of checks I had written over the years to Dylan and Sienna. Some were for big moments, like their wedding and the rounds of IVF they went through. Others were for emergencies they had claimed were temporary. I added up the amounts in my head, the numbers stacking higher than I expected. I made a note to keep these records separate in case I needed them later. Downstairs again, I sat in the armchair by the front window. The apple trees in the yard were bare and still, their branches black against the pale sky. I thought about the seasons they had stood through, storms off the Sound, winters that froze the ground solid, summers that baked the grass to brittle gold. They had kept standing. I began to consider the next step. I knew that confronting Dylan and Sienna now would only alert them. If they were already speaking with an agent, they might try to move faster. I needed to give them no reason to change their pace, while I found a way to secure the house. The list in my notebook had become more than just dates and events. It was a map of decisions, each one a missed opportunity to see what was right in front of me. That recognition carried a sting, but it also gave me something to work with. I had the advantage of knowing what they thought I did not. I closed the notebook and slid it into the drawer of the side table. Outside, the ferry horn sounded faintly across the water. It was a reminder of the years I had spent keeping things on schedule no matter the weather. I understood the rhythm of preparation and patience, and now I understood that I would need both. 2 days after I had finished filling my notebook, Dylan called to say they wanted to come by for lunch. His tone was casual, but there was a slight pause before he spoke each sentence, as if he was choosing his words with more care than usual. I told him to come around noon. Sienna's voice floated in from the background, light and polite, and then the line clicked off. I set the table that morning without much thought to the food. I made a simple salad, roasted a chicken, and set out bread and butter. My focus was not on the meal. I wanted to see what they would bring with them, what kind of story they had prepared. They arrived right on time. Sienna carried a bakery box, and Dylan had a folder tucked under his arm. We sat down, and for the first few minutes, the conversation was nothing more than comments about the weather and traffic. Then, without warning, Dylan slid the folder onto the table and opened it toward me. Inside was a printed packet, neatly bound, with the heading Authorization to Represent Property Owner. Below that was my name and address. He began explaining how this was a preliminary agreement, nothing binding, just something to let a brokerage start exploring the market. Sienna leaned forward, her tone warm, saying this was all in my best interest, to help me transition smoothly. I looked at the first page. The listing price they had filled in was $1,320,000. Next to it was a column labeled Estimated Net Proceeds. It showed $1,220,000 after fees. Dylan pointed at the number and said it would be enough to cover everything they needed and still leave me with a comfortable cushion. Then came the part that told me everything I needed to know. Dylan explained that they had already spoken to a potential buyer who was interested in making an offer before the property even went public. Sienna added that moving quickly could save time and spare me the hassle of open houses and strangers walking through my home. I kept my eyes on the papers, scanning for the details they probably hoped I would overlook. The commission rate was higher than average. The closing date was marked for just 60 days out, and the buyer's name was left blank, a space waiting to be filled. The air in the kitchen felt heavier. I could hear the low hum of the refrigerator behind their voices. My fork rested on the edge of my plate, untouched. Every word confirmed what Leo had told me. This was not an idea they were toying with. It was already in motion. I asked Dylan to explain how he thought the transition would work. He spoke quickly, outlining a plan that had me moving into a 2-bedroom condo in Seattle, close to Sienna's family. He mentioned a building with a community lounge and weekly game nights. Sienna added that I would not have to worry about repairs or lawn care. The way they described it, the move sounded like a favor, a gift wrapped in convenience. But in the middle of their polished pitch, Dylan let slip a detail that cut through everything else. He said that with the proceeds from the sale, they could pay off the $120,000 lost in his cryptocurrency investment and secure the $450,000 buy-in for the franchise they wanted. Sienna's hand touched his arm lightly, as if to tell him to be careful, but it was too late. I sat back in my chair, letting the silence stretch. Sienna reached for her coffee cup, eyes fixed on the table. Dylan shifted in his seat. The moment had changed, and they could feel it. I told them I appreciated them bringing me the information, that I would look it over. I slid the papers back into the folder and closed it. The rest of lunch passed in short, shallow exchanges. They spoke about a trip they were planning for the summer, a friend's wedding in California. I listened without offering much in return. My mind was already moving in another direction. After they left, I cleared the table slowly, placing each dish in the sink. The house was quiet again, but the silence no longer felt the same. I went to the living room and sat in my chair by the window. The ferry was crossing in the distance, its white wake cutting clean through the grey water. I thought about what had just happened, the way they had come into my home with their plan neatly laid out, confident that I would sign away the place without a second thought. I thought about the numbers they had presented, and how easily they had woven their own needs into the story of what was supposedly best for me. It was no longer a matter of suspicion. I had heard it from them directly. This was a calculated move, not a conversation. And in their calculations, I was a line item, a means to an end. I went to my desk and opened the drawer where I had placed my notebook. I added a new section, noting the date and everything said at the table. I included the listing price, the estimated net proceeds, and the exact figures Dylan had mentioned about his losses and the franchise buy-in. The page filled quickly. I closed the notebook and sat for a long moment, looking at the apple trees outside. The branches swayed slightly in the wind. The trees had stood through storms and drought, holding their ground year after year. I knew then that I would do the same. The morning after that lunch, I called Harper Lynn. I had met her years earlier at a community fundraiser and remembered her as someone who spoke little but listened closely. When I told her what had happened, there was no hesitation. She suggested we meet that afternoon at her office in Winslow. Her office sat on the second floor of a brick building overlooking the marina. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and cedar polish. She closed the door and motioned for me to sit at a long table, already set with a legal pad, a pen, and a folder with my name typed neatly on the tab. I laid out the details from my notebook, the copies of the checks, and the folder Dylan had left with me. She listened without interrupting, her eyes moving between my notes and the documents. When I finished, she folded her hands on the table. We need to secure your ownership in a way that cannot be undone without your consent. She began sketching a plan on the pad in quick, precise lines. The first step would be a life estate deed, naming me as the life tenant with the right to occupy the house for the rest of my life, and naming Leo as the remainder man who would inherit it after my passing. This would ensure that no sale could proceed without both our signatures. The second step was to record a memorandum of lease for 99 years, with a token rent of $1 a year, listing me as the tenant. It sounded redundant at first, but Harper explained that it created another layer of possession rights, making any forced sale far more complicated. The third layer was to transfer the property into an LLC, with the sole member being a family trust she would establish for me. I would be the current trustee and beneficiary, and she would serve as the successor trustee if I could no longer act. This structure would shift ownership away from me personally while still giving me full control, adding another shield against outside pressure. For the fourth measure, she suggested granting a conservation easement to the Bainbridge Land Trust, covering the waterfront strip and the stand of apple trees. It would preserve those areas from development and give the trust the right of first refusal if the property were ever put up for sale. In practical terms, it would deter most speculative buyers and lower the market appeal for anyone looking to flip the property. Lastly, Harper picked up the folder of old checks and made a note. These will be converted into promissory notes with defined repayment terms. They will be referenced in your updated will and trust with a no-contest clause. If Dylan or Sienna challenge the estate, they risk forfeiting any remaining inheritance while still owing the debt. We went through each step again, this time with Harper explaining how the filings would be recorded with the county and in what order. The sequence mattered. The life estate deed and the lease memorandum would be recorded first. The LLC transfer would follow, then the easement. The trust documents would be signed and notarized on the same day. She moved through it like a captain charting a route through narrow waters, careful to avoid every hidden reef. By the time we had finished, the outline on her pad looked like a fortress built in layers. Harper gathered the papers into a neat stack and told me she could have the first documents ready within 48 hours. She recommended that I not alert Dylan or Sienna until everything was filed and stamped. They will assume nothing has changed. That will give you room to move without interference. I left her office feeling the solid weight of the plan in my mind. The air outside was crisp, the sky a pale winter blue. As I walked back to my car, I thought about the ferry schedules I used to manage. Every crossing had to be timed against the tides and the weather, and sometimes the safest choice was to delay departure until the moment was right. At home, I pulled the folder of important documents from the desk drawer and set it on the dining table. I added the deed, the insurance policies, and the most recent property tax statement to the pile Harper had already seen. I also included photographs of the house and the land from over the years, thinking they might be useful for the easement paperwork. That evening, I sat by the window with the notebook in my lap, adding a new section labeled Plan. Under it, I wrote each of Harper's steps in order, leaving space beneath each one to note when it was completed. The act of writing it down made it real, something I could follow like a set of instructions when the days ahead grew crowded. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the occasional creak of the wood as the temperature dropped. I could picture Dylan and Sienna talking in their kitchen, believing they had time to move me into their plan. What they did not know was that my own plan was already in motion. I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer. The ferry horn sounded faintly across the water, steady and sure. I felt the same steadiness settling in me. Whatever they intended, I now had the means to hold my ground. The rest would come down to timing and patience, and I had both. 2 days after meeting with Harper, I called Dylan. My voice was calm, almost tired, as I told him I was still thinking about the papers he had brought and that I might be open to hearing more. I suggested we all sit down again soon. He sounded relieved, the kind of relief that slips into a voice when someone thinks they are back in control. In the background, I could hear Sienna asking something, her tone lifting at the end. Dylan said they could come by this weekend. I agreed, setting the time without giving them a choice. After I hung up, I called Harper. She already had most of the documents ready and was waiting on the final signatures. We decided the filings would be done the day before Dylan and Sienna arrived. Harper also arranged for an escrow office to be available if needed, one that had full security cameras and an audio system that met the state's recording consent laws. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the property, taking note of every detail. The apple trees stood bare, their branches slick with cold dew. The dock was quiet, except for the sound of water lapping at the posts. I wanted these images fresh in my mind, a reminder of what was at stake. Leo stopped by that afternoon, riding up the gravel path with his backpack slung over one shoulder. He noticed the stack of folders on the table and asked if I was getting things in order. I told him I was, and that it was important he not mention any of it to his parents. He nodded, his eyes steady, the way a person looks when they understand the weight of a promise. On Friday, Harper and I met again in her office. The life estate deed and the memorandum of lease were signed, notarized, and sent to the county recorder. The transfer to the LLC followed, and the conservation easement papers were prepared for submission. The promissory notes for the past loans were formalized with repayment schedules. Each document went into a sealed envelope with the date and filing number written in Harper's careful script. When we were done, Harper slid a small digital recorder across the table. She explained how it worked, how to start it with one touch, and where to place it so the microphone would catch the entire room. She reminded me that Washington requires consent for recordings, so the plan was to have everyone meet in a space where there were posted signs stating the area was monitored. The escrow office she had booked for Sunday had those signs on the door. I drove home with the envelopes on the passenger seat, their weight heavier than paper should feel. At the kitchen table, I stacked them neatly and placed the recorder on top. The house felt still, but I could sense the current moving under the surface, pulling us all towards Sunday. That night I prepared the living room for their visit. I arranged the chairs so there was a clear line of sight to the coffee table, where I planned to place the folder they had left with me. I wanted them to see it as soon as they walked in. I also set out fresh coffee cups and a plate of crackers, the kind of neutral hospitality that would keep them from thinking I was on edge. On Saturday, I kept to my routine. I went to the market in the morning, spoke briefly with neighbours, and walked down to the dock. The less I changed my patterns, the less reason they had to suspect anything. By evening, the sky was streaked with pale orange, and the air carried the sharp scent of salt and wood smoke. I stood on the porch for a long time, letting the quiet settle around me. Sunday arrived cold and clear. At 11:30, I drove to the escrow office ahead of schedule. Harper was already there, reviewing the setup. The cameras were positioned to cover the table and the seating area. A small sign by the door read, "Notice, this area is under audio and video surveillance." She handed me a copy of the filed documents in a clean manila folder and placed the originals in a secure drawer behind her desk. At exactly noon, Dylan and Sienna arrived. They both wore smiles that looked practiced. Dylan carried another folder, and Sienna had a leather planner tucked under her arm. We greeted each other and sat down. The recorder was in plain view on the table, part of the office's standard setup. Dylan started by saying he was glad I was open to talking again. He opened his folder and began going over the numbers from before, adding small adjustments as if he had refined the plan. Sienna spoke about how quickly they could make the transition happen, emphasizing that the timing was ideal. I listened, nodding occasionally, letting them talk. The recorder's small light blinked steadily. Harper entered quietly a few minutes later, greeting everyone and taking a seat at the end of the table. Her presence seemed to tighten the air in the room. Dylan's pace slowed, and Sienna's smile lost some of its ease. By the time they had finished their pitch, everything we needed was captured. The offers, the urgency, the connection to their own financial needs. I closed the folder in front of me and said I would take their proposal under consideration. Harper gathered her papers, and I rose to leave. Outside, the air was sharp against my face. I walked to my car with the manila folder tucked under my arm, each step measured. The pieces were in place now. The next move would not be mine to rush, but when it came, it would be ready. Monday morning, the day after the meeting at the escrow office, I woke with the sense that something was already moving. The air felt different, the way it does when the tide turns in the middle of the night. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the manila folder Harper had given me still in the same place I had left it. I opened it and went over the sequence of filings again, letting the order settle into my mind like a checklist before a departure. By 9 o'clock, Harper called. She had reviewed the audio and video from the meeting. Every detail we had hoped for was there. Dylan's own voice, linking the sale to his investment loss and the franchise buy-in. Sienna, speaking about the timing and the potential buyer who wanted to move quickly. The clarity in their words left little room for doubt or reinterpretation. Harper said the quality of the recording was excellent, and copies had been stored securely in 3 different locations. After we hung up, I sat for a moment, thinking about how calm my hands felt. There was no rush of adrenaline, no anger boiling over, only the steadiness that comes from knowing the ground you stand on is solid. I cleared the table and went upstairs to my office. The file cabinet drawers slid open easily, the neat rows of folders a reminder of years spent keeping things in order. I pulled out the most recent property tax statement, the insurance policy, and the appraisal from 2 years ago. They would be useful if Dylan and Sienna tried to dispute the value of the house or the terms of ownership. Around midday, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. It was from a man introducing himself as a financial consultant working with Dylan and Sienna. He outlined how a sale at the current market price of $1,320,000 would net enough to pay off debts and secure a strong future for the family. The message was written with a professional polish, but there was a line that caught my attention. He mentioned capital gains implications that were plainly incorrect for a primary residence. Either he was careless, or he assumed I would not notice. I printed the email and placed it with the other documents. Then I called Harper to tell her about it. She asked me to forward it and said she would keep it as part of the growing file. The more threads we had, the stronger the fabric would be if we needed to present it. Later in the afternoon, I decided to take a walk down to the dock. The water was calm, the ferry making its steady crossing in the distance. Standing there, I thought about the years I had worked in operations, how the smallest oversight could ripple out into bigger problems. This situation felt the same. Every detail mattered, and missing even one could shift the balance. When I returned to the house, there was a voicemail waiting. It was Dylan. His tone was smooth, but underneath I could hear a hint of pressure. He said they had been speaking with the agent again and that an offer might be ready soon. He urged me to think about how much simpler life could be without the upkeep of the house. I saved the message and made a note in my notebook about the date and time. By evening, I had a complete folder with the property documents, the promissory notes, the recordings, the email from the consultant, and the voicemail from Dylan. It was a record not just of their intentions, but of the pattern they had followed. Laying it all out in front of me, I could see the progression clearly. The casual comments, the subtle pressure, the polished pitches, and now the direct move to line up a buyer. I thought about calling Leo, but decided against it. He had already done more than enough, and the less he was involved at this stage, the better. This was a point where quiet, deliberate action mattered more than conversation. Before bed, I called Harper one more time. We discussed the possibility of sending a formal notice through her office if Dylan or Sienna attempted to move forward without my consent. She suggested waiting until they made a clear overstep, which would give the notice more weight. I agreed. Timing was everything, and I was willing to let them believe the path ahead was still clear for them. The house was dark except for the lamp by my chair. I sat there for a while, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the beams as the night air settled in. The documents were back in their place, the plan intact, and the record growing stronger by the day. I knew there would be more calls, more messages, and more small maneuvers meant to push me toward their goal. But each one would only add to the file. Each one would make my position stronger when the moment came to put a stop to it for good. When I finally turned off the light, the quiet of the house felt like an anchor. Everything outside might shift and pull, but here, for now, nothing moved without me allowing it. By midweek, the rhythm of their pressure began to change. Where before Dylan's calls had been spaced days apart, now there were messages waiting each morning. The tone carried more urgency, though still wrapped in a polite veneer. On Wednesday, he left a message saying they had a serious buyer lined up, someone willing to pay in cash, and that acting quickly would secure the deal. He mentioned how rare it was to find buyers in this market who could close without financing. I wrote down every word in my notebook, adding it to the growing timeline. The steady documentation gave me a strange sense of calm. Each new attempt on their part was another brick in the wall I was building around myself. On Thursday, Sienna appeared at my door without warning. She held a paper coffee cup and wore that fixed smile I had seen so many times at family gatherings. She spoke lightly about wanting to check in, saying she had been in the neighborhood. I invited her in, keeping my tone neutral. She sat at the kitchen table and began talking about a couple she knew who had been looking for a place on Bainbridge. They loved older waterfront homes, she said, and would be willing to offer more than asking to avoid a bidding war. Her words were casual, but the undercurrent was clear. I let her talk while I made a fresh pot of coffee. The smell filled the kitchen, grounding me as I listened. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping as she mentioned how hard it was for Dylan to focus on his work, with the uncertainty of the house hanging over them. She framed it as concern for him, but I could hear the pressure threaded through each sentence. When she left, I walked her to the door and thanked her for stopping by. As soon as the door closed, I wrote down the details of the visit: time, date, what she said, the tone of her voice. I was no longer reacting emotionally to these moments. They had become data points, pieces in a larger picture that was nearly complete. That afternoon, I called Harper and updated her. She listened, then said she would be ready to move at a moment's notice. She reminded me that our filings were already recorded and secure, but that having these interactions documented would give additional leverage if things escalated. By Friday, I had the sense they were trying to accelerate their timeline. Another voicemail from Dylan came mid-morning, this time with a firm note about needing a decision soon. He mentioned that the buyer they had in mind was looking at another property and would not wait forever. It was meant to sound like a warning, but to me it confirmed that they were feeling the pressure themselves. I decided to use that. That evening, I called Dylan back and told him I would be willing to meet on Sunday to go over everything one last time. I suggested we hold the meeting at my house. He agreed quickly, perhaps too quickly, and said he would bring Sienna and the final paperwork. After the call, I walked through the house slowly, noting what needed to be put in order before they arrived. The living room would be the center of the meeting, the coffee table cleared except for the folder of their original proposal. I wanted it in plain sight, a reminder that I still had it. Saturday passed quietly. I kept to my routine, avoiding anything that might hint at what was coming. In the evening, I stood at the window and watched the last ferry of the day cross the dark water, its lights reflecting on the surface. The calm of that moment stayed with me. On Sunday morning, I woke early and prepared the house. The chairs were arranged so that I could see them clearly without obstruction. A fresh pot of coffee was ready in the kitchen. The folder sat on the table, its edges perfectly aligned with the wood grain. They arrived just after noon. Dylan carried a slim briefcase, and Sienna wore a look of determined warmth. We exchanged polite greetings before sitting down. Dylan opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers, sliding them across the table toward me. He began outlining the terms again, speaking with the same practiced confidence he had used before. I listened without interruption, my eyes moving from the papers to their faces. Sienna added small points about the buyer's flexibility, how they could adjust the closing date if needed. She smiled as she spoke, but her fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the table. When they finished, I placed my hand on the folder in front of me but did not open it. Instead, I said I would review their offer carefully. My tone was steady, giving nothing away. Dylan nodded, though I could see the flicker of impatience in his eyes. Sienna gathered her planner, her movements a little sharper than when she arrived. As they left, I watched from the porch until their car disappeared down the road. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels full rather than empty. Inside, the folder remained on the table, untouched. I knew we were nearing the point where all the threads they had pulled would tighten around them, and I was ready. By Monday morning, I could sense the shift. The polite fronts were wearing thin. Dylan left another voicemail, his words clipped, saying they needed to know my decision within the week. He spoke as if the matter was inevitable, as if my role was simply to agree to what had already been set in motion. I replayed the message once, then saved it and wrote a short note in my timeline. The day passed quietly. I spent the afternoon going over Harper's notes, making sure I understood each step we had taken and the layers protecting the property. It was all in place now, filed, recorded, and shielded from any sudden move they might try. The only thing left was to let them make the next step in full view, so that when the time came to end this, it would be clean and final. On Tuesday, a letter arrived by courier. The envelope was heavy, the kind used for contracts. Inside was a formal purchase offer from an unnamed buyer, represented by the same agent Dylan had mentioned. The offer matched the numbers they had pushed before, with a closing date just 60 days away. It included a line stating that the seller would vacate the property within 30 days of closing, leaving it in what they called broom-clean condition. The terms were firm, written to leave little room for negotiation. I read through the pages slowly, noting the exact wording. There was no mention of a life estate, no acknowledgement of the easement, no reference to any existing lease or LLC ownership. It was as if none of those protections existed, as if they believed I would simply sign and clear the way. I called Harper and read her the details. She told me to bring it to her office immediately. When I arrived, she scanned through the pages with quick precision, marking points with a yellow pen. She smiled faintly, not from amusement, but from recognition. This, she said, was exactly the kind of oversight we had prepared for. The offer was written to a name and title that no longer held legal ownership in the way they imagined. Even if I signed it, it would be invalid without the approval of the LLC and the trustee. Harper suggested we send a short acknowledgement through her office, thanking them for the offer and stating that it would be reviewed by the current property owner of record. That would be the first time they would hear in direct, formal language that the structure around the house had changed. It would not reveal all the details, but it would be enough to unsettle their timeline. We drafted the letter together. It was no more than 3 sentences, polite and neutral, with my signature below the typed name of the LLC. Harper sent it by certified mail and email to both the agent and the return address on the offer. The copy for Dylan and Sienna would arrive the following day. On Wednesday afternoon, the phone rang. It was Dylan. His tone was no longer smooth. He asked why the letter had come from an LLC and what it meant. I told him calmly that all matters regarding the property were now handled through the trust and its management. I kept my voice steady, offering no explanation beyond that. There was a pause on the line, a silence that felt heavier than anything he could have said. He ended the call quickly. That evening, I walked down to the dock. The air was cold, the tide low, the pilings standing tall above the waterline. I thought about how much had changed in just a few weeks, how what began as quiet suspicion had become a clear line I would not allow them to cross. The protections were no longer ideas on paper. They were recorded facts, standing like the pilings beneath me, rooted deep where the current could not move them. Thursday brought another envelope, this one thinner. Inside was a letter from the agent stating that the offer was contingent on clear title and vacant possession, and that any encumbrances would need to be resolved before closing. It was written in careful, non-confrontational language, but the meaning was clear. They now understood that the property was not theirs to move without my consent. I placed the letter in the growing file and called Harper again. She said we would hold our position. There was no need to respond unless they made a formal challenge. Every piece of correspondence, every voicemail, every visit was another entry in the record. By Friday, I had not heard from Dylan or Sienna again. The house was quiet, except for the sound of the wind in the apple trees. I sat at the dining table with the folder open in front of me, the letters and contracts arranged in order. The plan had held, and the shift I had sensed at the start of the week was now complete. They were no longer moving toward me with confidence. They were circling, looking for a way through, and finding none. I closed the folder and placed it back in its drawer. The light outside was fading, the last of the sun touching the tops of the trees. For the first time in weeks, I felt the kind of calm that comes not from waiting, but from knowing the ground beneath you is secure. Whatever came next would have to meet the full weight of what we had built, and I was ready. By the following Monday, the air around the situation had grown still, but it was the stillness before a shift, not a resolution. I woke early, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table watching the light come over the water. The file drawer in the sideboard was closed, but I could feel the weight of everything inside it. The silence from Dylan and Sienna was unusual, and unusual meant they were recalculating. Around mid-morning, Harper called. She had received a copy of a title inquiry from the buyer's side, requesting clarification on the LLC and the easement. She explained that this was standard once they realized the property structure was not what they expected, but the timing told her they were still looking for a way forward. Her advice was simple: hold the line. Do nothing that would change the landscape we had built. That afternoon, I walked the length of the property, from the apple trees near the road down to the dock. The tide was halfway in, the water shifting in slow swells. The house stood behind me, solid in the pale winter light. Every step reminded me that the fight was no longer about defending what I had, but about making sure it would never be taken without my consent. On Tuesday, a courier came with a letter addressed directly to me, bypassing Harper's office. It was from Dylan. The language was polite, but the message was personal. He wrote that he felt blindsided by the legal changes, that it was hurtful I had not discussed them with him first. He framed his concern as disappointment, not anger, but it was clear he was trying to appeal to the history between us. I read it twice, then placed it in the file without comment. My mind went back to Harper's words from the beginning. Once the structure is in place, let them reveal themselves. This was another reveal. It showed that the business tone they had been using was giving way to something more raw. On Wednesday morning, I took the ferry into Seattle for errands. Moving through the crowd on the deck, I felt the kind of anonymity that comes from being away from the immediate situation. It gave me space to think. The past weeks had been a series of measured moves, each one made with care. Now, the shape of the end was beginning to show. It would not be a confrontation in the open, but a closing of a door they had assumed would stay ajar. When I returned home, there was a message from Harper saying she had sent a short, formal reply to the title inquiry, confirming the LLC ownership, the trust, and the easement. It was factual, without commentary, leaving no opening for argument. She assured me this would make it clear to any buyer that the property could not be transferred without the trustees' direct consent. By Thursday, the phone calls from Dylan had stopped entirely. Sienna sent one brief text in the evening saying she hoped I was well. It was the kind of message that carries no purpose beyond testing the line. I left it unanswered. Friday morning brought another envelope, this one from the buyer's agent. Inside was a short notice that they were withdrawing the offer and moving on to other opportunities. The language was clean, without blame, but I could feel the frustration underneath. I set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment before adding it to the file. The sequence was now complete. That afternoon I called Harper. She agreed that this was likely the end of their immediate attempt to take the house. We talked about keeping everything as it was, maintaining the protections without change. She suggested we do a quiet review in 6 months to make sure nothing had shifted in county records. The evening was cold and still. I made tea and sat in the living room with the lamp on low. The house felt settled again, the air inside no longer carrying the tension of the past weeks. Outside, the apple trees stood in their winter rest, their bare branches dark against the fading light. I thought about the first moment Leo had come to me with the warning, how small it had seemed then compared to what it became. I thought about the careful steps, the patience, the way each move had been measured not for speed, but for stability. By the time I went to bed, I knew this was not just an end to their attempt. It was also the beginning of a new chapter for me, one where the boundaries were not implied, but set in stone. The house would stand as it always had, not because I had fought loudly for it, but because I had made it impossible for anyone to quietly take it away. The week after the buyer withdrew, the house seemed to exhale. The air felt lighter, as if the weight of their intentions had finally lifted. I went about my mornings without the undercurrent of waiting for the phone to ring or the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. The file drawer in the sideboard stayed closed, but I knew it was there, holding the entire history of what had just passed. On Monday, Harper called to confirm the withdrawal had been filed with the county. She had already checked the title records and confirmed that nothing had changed on the property's status. Her voice was steady as she told me that, for now, the matter was settled. She reminded me to keep all correspondence and records as they were, untouched, in case they were ever needed again. That afternoon, I walked the length of the shoreline. The tide was high, and the water lapped softly against the dock. The sky was clear, a pale winter blue. I thought about how close they had come to moving me out of this place, how quietly it could have happened if I had not been told the truth in time. The thought did not stir anger now, only a deeper resolve to keep things as they were meant to be. Tuesday brought a different kind of quiet. No letters, no calls, no unexpected visitors. I spent the day pruning the apple trees, cutting away dead wood, so that the branches could breathe and grow in spring. The rhythm of it was grounding, the kind of work that reminded me of seasons passing in their own time, untouched by the urgency of anyone's plans but nature's. On Wednesday, I went into town for groceries. At the market, I saw Sienna near the dairy section. She smiled faintly, a guarded kind of smile, and nodded. We spoke briefly, only about the weather and a new shipment of winter pears. Her tone was polite, but there was no attempt to bring up the house. I left with my basket full, feeling the same calm I had carried since the offer fell apart. Thursday morning, Harper sent me a short update. She had completed the final step in our plan, ensuring that the conservation easement and the trust were linked in the county database. That meant any future inquiry into the property would immediately show multiple layers of ownership and restriction. It was, as she put it, a quiet wall that no one could push through without my hand opening the door. That afternoon, I went through the folders in my desk, not to change anything, but to be certain everything was in order. The documents lay in a clear sequence, from the earliest notes I had written after Leo spoke to me to the final correspondence from the buyer's agent. Each page was dated, each conversation recorded in my own handwriting. It was not just a record, it was a map of every turn the situation had taken. By Friday, the rhythm of my days had returned. I cooked in the mornings, read in the afternoons, and walked the property at dusk. The water near the dock had frozen in thin sheets along the edges, catching the last of the light. Standing there, I thought about the patience it had taken to reach this point. The plan had worked not because it was loud or aggressive, but because it had been precise, layered, and unshakable. Saturday brought a letter from the Bainbridge Land Trust, confirming the conservation easement was now active and permanent. It was written in plain language, with a map of the protected areas. I traced the lines on the map with my finger, following the curve of the shoreline and the cluster of apple trees. These were no longer just parts of my land. They were now legally shielded, tied to the future in a way that could not be undone. On Sunday, I woke early and made coffee. The air was cold, and the windows held a thin layer of frost. I sat at the kitchen table with the map from the land trust spread out in front of me. The quiet of the house was complete, not the tense quiet of waiting, but the settled kind that comes when nothing is pressing at the door. As the light came over the water, I realized this was the first morning in weeks that my mind had not gone to Dylan or Sienna. Whatever they thought or planned now was outside the walls of this house, outside the reach of the protections we had built. I could tend to my days again without watching for their shadow. When I put the map away, I noticed the clock on the wall, its steady rhythm filling the room. The weeks of maneuvering, the careful steps, the long hours of waiting had brought me here, to this moment where the house stood as it had before, but stronger for what had been done to guard it. I closed the drawer, turned the key, and let the stillness hold. The first week of February arrived with a stretch of cold, dry days. The kind of weather that made the air sharp in my lungs, but left the water glassy and still. Each morning, I followed the same quiet routine: coffee at the kitchen table, a walk through the yard, and a glance toward the apple trees. The tension that had filled these moments not long ago was gone, replaced by something steadier, more rooted. On Monday, I sorted through the last of the seasonal bills. Everything was in order. The property taxes were paid, the insurance renewed, the easement and trust fully active. It struck me that for the first time in months, there were no open questions hanging over the house, no papers waiting for my signature, no calls to return. It was a clean slate, yet one built on every step taken in the weeks before. Midweek, Harper called to confirm the 6-month review date we had agreed upon. She said she would mark it on her calendar, and that there was no need for us to speak again until then unless something unexpected came up. Her voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the satisfaction in it too. She knew the structure we had built was not just a defense, it was permanent. That afternoon, I walked to the dock and stood looking out over the water. The ferry was making its slow approach across the channel, the sound of its engines carrying over the still air. I thought about the rhythm of its crossings, how it moved without rush but with purpose, arriving exactly where it needed to be. The past weeks had been the same, every move deliberate, each one landing where it belonged. Thursday brought a letter from the Trust's bank, confirming all account details were in good standing. I placed it in the file with the rest. The drawer was nearly full now, not from clutter, but from the record of every moment in this process. It was a kind of history, one I had lived in real time, but could now hold in my hands. In the evening, I noticed a faint blush of colour in the sky as the sun set. Winter was still holding, but there was a quiet promise in that light, a reminder that seasons turn even when it feels like nothing will change. On Friday, I decided to spend the morning in the garden. The soil was cold, but I cleared the beds, cutting away last year's growth. It was a simple act, but one that felt symbolic. Clearing space for what comes next, not clinging to what had already run its course. Saturday passed without interruption. I read in the living room, the sound of the clock steady in the background. The house felt entirely my own again, not because it had changed, but because I had reclaimed every corner of it from the uncertainty that once shadowed it. By Sunday, I realized it had been nearly 2 weeks since I had last thought of Dylan or Sienna with any weight. They were part of the record now, not part of my daily life, Whatever their plans or frustrations might be, they existed beyond the reach of my days. That morning I took the long path through the property, moving slowly, noticing the details I had overlooked when my attention was pulled toward defense. The moss on the north side of the trees was thick and green. A heron stood near the water's edge, still as a stone until it lifted into the air with a slow, deliberate beat of its wings. When I returned to the house, I unlocked the drawer and looked at the file one last time before closing it for good. The pages inside told a story, one of quiet persistence and unshaken resolve. It was not a tale of open conflict, but of holding ground with patience until the pressure broke on its own. The house was silent, except for the wind brushing against the windows. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the light shift across the water. The weeks of strain had passed, leaving behind not just relief, but a deeper sense of my own boundaries. I had not just kept the house, I had kept the shape of my life intact, and in that, there was a steadiness no one could take. Spring came slowly that year. By March, the light stayed longer in the evenings, casting a warm gold across the apple trees. The buds began to swell on the branches, small signs that winter had loosened its grip. I moved through the house with a sense of ease I had not felt in months, each room holding its familiar quiet without the shadow of intrusion. The file remained in its drawer, untouched but present. I no longer felt the need to check it. Its weight was steady enough in my mind, a quiet assurance that every step taken had held. The trust, the easement, the lease, the layers of protection, each stood in place, and with them came the freedom to turn my thoughts elsewhere. One morning, I walked the path to the dock just as the sun lifted over the horizon. The water was smooth, the reflection so clear it was hard to see where the sky ended. I thought of the months before, when each walk had been filled with calculation, measuring what I could risk and what I could lose. Now there was no calculation, only the rhythm of the tide and the sound of gulls calling across the channel. The season carried me into small routines, planting new herbs in the garden, repainting the trim on the porch, sharing coffee with neighbors who stopped by. Life no longer felt like it was lived in defense, it was lived in presence. There were moments when the memory of their plans would rise, Dylan's clipped messages, Sienna's polished smiles, but they passed quickly. They no longer carried weight. What remained instead was the knowledge of what I had done to protect this place and myself. By late April, the apple trees were in bloom. Their blossoms held the air with a light sweetness, drifting into the open windows. I stood among them one afternoon, my hands resting lightly on a branch, and realized that the house and the land had come through the storm unchanged. I had too, though not untouched. I carried with me now a sharper understanding of boundaries, of what it meant to stand without bending to pressure. The dock, the trees, the house, they were mine in the way that mattered most, not just by law, but by the steady truth that I had chosen to keep them. The quiet of that truth was deeper than any relief. It was a kind of peace. I knew there would be other seasons, other challenges, but this chapter had closed with the walls intact, the ground firm beneath my feet, and the knowledge that no one could move me without my say. That was enough. If you've stayed with me through this story, you know it wasn't just about a house. It was about holding on to what matters when others think they can take it from you. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to quietly, patiently, but firmly protect your ground? I would love to hear how you navigated it. Share your thoughts in the comments so we can remind each other that sometimes the strongest defense is the one made in silence.